In this three-part tutorial series, we'll be building Tetris in Unity from start to finish. By the end of this, we'll have a fully functioning game with high scores, sound effects, the works. This series is for educational purposes only. The Tetris IP is owned by the Tetris company, who are notoriously litigious. Seriously, don't try to publish or sell this. In part 1, we'll be focusing on setting up the visual elements within Unity. Part 2 will go over the majority of our game logic, and part 3 will cover implementation of music and sound effects. As always, a big thank you to those who support this channel through Patreon or through purchasing my game or novels, links to all of which will be in the description. Couldn't do this without you. We've got an empty 2D Unity project here. We're going to go to our camera, down to environment, and we'll select our background color and change that to black. Close that up. We'll go over here and we will right click and create an empty object which we'll call Tetris Grid. We're going to make a new folder called scripts, and inside that we'll make a new mono behavior which we'll call Tetris Grid. What we're doing right now is just creating the visual for our grid that our play area is going to consist of, so that we can set up our UI elements in relation to that grid so that everything's positioned the way we want it to be. So open up that script and we'll serialize field, make an int, and we'll call this width, and we'll set that to 10. And then we'll do the exact same thing with another one that we'll call height, but we'll set it to 20. And then we'll create a public transform array, which we'll call grid. Now let's create the awake method, and in there we will initialize the grid to equal a new transform with the width and height we've set. Next, we're going to do private void onDrawGizmos. This is how we can visualize something in the Unity editor. This is a useful tool that can be used for all kinds of things. Drawing raycasts so that you can visualize, like, say, enemy sight lines, things like that. Being able to see a sphere cast for, like, maybe seeing if you wanted to create an enemy who can hear the player, you might be able to see the range of something like that in the scene. This is really useful for that. Now we're going to create a for loop here, and this is the syntax for for loops. We have int, and then we're doing x equals 0, x less than or equal to width, x plus plus. And then we're going to set up a vector 3, we'll call it start, and it'll equal our origin plus a new vector 3, we'll go 0, y, 0, semicolon that out. Go down a level, vector 3, end, and I just realized that makes no sense above there. We're going to change that to be vector 3, x, 0, 0, not 0, y. Anyway, we'll get to the y later. Vector 3 end equals origin plus new vector 3 x height 0. Again, this is just telling Unity how we want to visualize. So let's go to gizmos.drawLine, and we'll do start and end. Now we can just copy and paste this because we're just going to change everywhere where it says x to y and everywhere where it says width to height, with some slight repositioning in our vector 3s below. So we'll do y less than or equal to height, y plus plus. Then for the start, we're going to change origin plus new vector 3 to be 0, y0, like I tried to do mistakenly before, and the endpoint to width 0, or width y0, excuse me. Now I realize I did something wrong here. For the vector 3 origin, we need the transform.position to be offset by -0.5 on the x and -0.5 on the y. That's just to make sure it actually shows up visually the way we expect. Let's drag and drop our Tetris grid script onto the object, make sure our gizmos are turned on so we can see that grid, and let's reposition our camera so that the grid is perfectly centered. This will be at 4.5 on the x-axis and 9.5 on the y. Now let's get to creating a 2D sprite, a square, and we'll rename this to left boundary. We're going to reposition that at -7 and 9.5. So it's basically right in the middle of that big empty space to the left. We'll scale it up on the X by 13 and 20 on the Y. And let's make this like a dark brown, just something kind of unobtrusive. That looks pretty good. Now let's duplicate this, and we can name it right boundary, and we'll drag it over to that empty right space. This will just make it really clear for our player where the walls are in the game. Set that to 16. Now we go to our game view, we're gonna see that these boundaries we just made aren't visible. The reason for that is because the main camera is at 0 on the Z-axis. We need to back it up. As soon as we get to -1, you'll be able to see it. I'm gonna back it up to -10, just so we have plenty of space. Now let's create our canvas. I'm gonna call this scoreboard, and we're gonna create an image underneath that we'll call high score title. For each element on our user interface, I'm gonna have the name of whatever it is we're looking at in a little bubble above the actual content. Let's set this to -625. We're gonna anchor it at the top, and we'll set the position to -y, the Y position to the Y position to -40. We'll set the width to 300 and the height to 50. Now, this doesn't look how I was expecting it to. Okay, in the canvas, I forgot to set the UI scale mode to scale with screen size and make sure it's 1920 by 1080. That looks closer to what I was expecting. Let's go back to this image, and I want to change the sprite to be Unity's built-in UI sprite, just to give it some rounded corners. Looks a little nicer to me, a little more like a bubble. And beneath that, let's go to UI, and we'll create a text object, which we will change the text to say high scores. We want to recenter this. And if we hold Alt and then double click the bottom right of the anchor, it'll scale it to be exactly the size of the object above it. Let's change the vertex color to black and change the material preset to the drop shadow one. Just give it a little more visibility. Now let's duplicate that, and we'll call this high scores. List. This will be our actual list of high scores, as you might imagine. We'll reposition the Y-axis to be at -165. The width will resize to about 400, and the height we can set to 255. Now you can see it's clipping in front of our high score title, so drag it above that object and you'll see it cuts behind it. So with Unity and its hierarchy, you want whatever you want in front to be lower. So that's why the list needs to be above the high score title, even though visually it's below it. And then we'll go to the text here, list all of our numbers, and let's reposition it on the left side. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's duplicate the title, and we're going to change this to score title. We're going to drag that over to +625, so it's on the right side of our boundaries here. Change the text to say score. And we can resize this score title to more like 200. It doesn't need to be that wide. Okay, let's duplicate that now and drag it above, and we'll call it score. We're going to reposition it on the Y down to -75. That looks pretty good. And size-wise, let's scale it up to 400 by 75. Give us plenty of room to have a big high score. For now, we'll initialize it at 0, anchor it back at just the center, and the text object we actually want to resize to 200 by 50 and move it down -5. And then we'll drop it to be aligned at the bottom. That looks pretty good to me. Looks pretty centered below that score. Let's duplicate both our score and score title twice, and we'll rename the first duplication to level, and then level title, because we want to keep track and let the player know what level they've reached. And then for the next one, we're going to call this lines and lines title. For the same reason, we want the player to be able to keep track of how many lines they've cleared. Let's go to level, and we'll reposition it down to -210 on the Y, and the level title we will reposition it down to -175. And then we're going to just reposition this at the same amount of distance from the next one, so that'll be -345 and -310. Now let's go into each of these texts and make sure they say the right thing. So we want the level text to start at 1, because we're not starting at 0, we're starting at 1. And the level title should just say level. And then we'll do the same thing with lines. Lines should actually start at 0. You don't start with any of them cleared yet. And we'll go down to lines title and make that say lines. Okay, it's looking pretty good. Let's duplicate our lines title now, and we'll call this preview, because later on we're going to want to set it up so that the next block that's going to spawn is visible to the player so they kind of have an idea of what's coming. Let's drag that down to about -445. I think that'll look pretty good. Okay, now let's create a button, and we'll call this pause game. Let's reposition this guy at the bottom. We're going to anchor it at the bottom, set it to 475 on the X and 50 on the Y. The width can stay at 160, but let's move the height up to somewhere around 75. Just nice and tall, something big and bubbly looking, and we'll change the text here to say pause. Now we'll duplicate this button here. Let's change the drop shadow text actually as well. Just again, I like that visibility. Let's duplicate the pause game button. We're going to call this start new game. We'll position this one at 775 and change the text to, you guessed it, start new game. Right now these buttons don't do anything, but they're just here so we can visualize what we need and how to make it all work. Now let's open up Microsoft Paint, as is becoming a tradition for us on this channel. We'll set the image properties width and height to be 256 by 256. Say okay to that, we'll zoom in. I'm just going to select our box creator tool here. I am not much of an artist, so forgive me. I'm going to click starting at 8 by 8 at the top left and drag it down to 248 by 248. You can see the position at the bottom left of the screen of where your mouse is. And you just want it to be even. So I'm just adding 8 on the front end and subtracting it on the back end. And then I'm taking the line tool and just dragging out from these corners to the edge of our image. I just want to make a little bit of a nicer looking box here for our blocks. Give them a 3D sense, even though we're working in 2D. So I'm gonna select a lighter gray with our fill tool, and then an even lighter one for the central image. I'm gonna leave the top sort of square as just plain white, and then I'll make the sides a little bit darker. And I'll make the bottom the darkest. Let's go down to say like 65 in our gray values here. I think the sides are a little darker than I actually want, so I'm going to go lighter than I did before and recolor those. Again, I'm not a very good artist, but you can see that at least this is starting to look like it has some dimension to it. I'm going to save this as a PNG, and then we'll go back into Unity and create a new folder that I'll just call Sprite. And I'm going to import that image into there and name it Tetramino Block Sprite. Make sure in the texture type it's set to Sprite and apply that. And then let's create another new folder, and I'll call this Prefabs. Now in our scene, I'm going to create another 2D sprite square, just like we did before. Let's zero out the transform. And I'm going to rename this block, the building block of all of our shapes that we're going to have in our game. And I'm going to change the sprite from square to our Tetramino block sprite that we've made. I'm going to change the order and layer to be 5 so that it's always visible in front of anything else. And we'll drag this into our prefabs, and now we have our block, literally our building block. Let's create another empty object, and we'll call this Tetramino I. Each of the pieces in Tetris are named after different letters. So you have your I block, your T block, L block, J block, S, Z, O, etc. And they're all built up, as the name Tetramino implies, of 4 sub-blocks. So we're going to have block 0, 1, 2, and 3. So that we can, for each of these blocks, we'll just reposition them to make the various shapes. So we'll drag and drop our block prefab underneath block 0. And let's just reset all of these transforms. We want everything to be zeroed out as a default. And if you click W, you'll be able to see where our pivot point is. And we want to make sure the pivot point is centered on our 0 block. Let's copy and paste, keeping our local transform underneath blocks 1, 2, and 3. Now we'll reposition blocks 1, 2, and 3. You can reposition everything by increments of 1 because of how we've set up our grid. So we're going to go -1 for the first one, +1 for the second, and +2 for the third. And now you see we have our eyepiece. Now it doesn't look very good, as a boring just white block. So I'm gonna change this to like a light blue. That looks pretty nice. And as you can see, because we've changed the sprite to be our little Microsoft Paint creation, there's a little bit of there's some amount of depth there that makes it look like you can really see the individual blocks. So let's drag that Tetramino eyepiece into our prefabs, and let's go to prefab, unpack completely, and we will rename this to Tetramino-T. We're going to create our T block. Now I'm going to fast forward to having created all of these, and I'll just show you how I've colored them and where I've put their pivot points. That'll do for the first third of this series. Stay tuned for part 2. I'll see you next time.